If you are reading this, it means I ran out of time. I must have read that sentence 5 times before I could continue. My hands trembled slightly as I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the letter. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched across the backyard my husband Henry loved so much. 3 years had passed since I lost him, yet seeing his handwriting again felt like hearing his voice from the next room. The letter had been hidden inside a wooden box I discovered while cleaning the attic. At first, I almost threw the box away. It sat beneath old holiday decorations and dusty photo albums, tucked into a corner I had not visited in years. The lid was scratched. The brass latch barely worked. Nothing about it suggested importance. Then I noticed my name written on a sealed envelope resting inside. Eleanor. The moment I saw Henry's handwriting, everything else disappeared. I carried the box downstairs and sat at the same kitchen table where we had shared coffee every morning for nearly 40 years. The house felt unusually quiet. My son David lived across town with his wife Rachel and rarely stopped by unless they needed something. Most days it was just me, the ticking clock on the wall, and memories that seemed to live in every room. I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the writing remained clear. Henry's penmanship was always neat, deliberate, the kind of handwriting that looked thoughtful even before you read the words. I took a deep breath and continued. If you are reading this, it means I ran out of time. There are things I should have told you years ago, things I hoped would never matter. My eyes stopped moving. For several seconds, I simply stared at the page. Henry was not a dramatic man. He never exaggerated. He never spoke in riddles. If he wrote something like that, there was a reason. I continued reading. You may be tempted to dismiss what follows as the worry of an aging husband. Please do not. Pay attention to what people do, not what they say. The sentence unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I folded the letter halfway closed and looked around the kitchen. Family. Photographs lined the walls. David as a little boy holding a baseball glove. Christmas mornings. Summer vacations. Decades of memories. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Yet something inside me shifted. Henry had spent his life protecting our family. Why would he leave behind a warning? I unfolded the letter again. The next paragraph mentioned a date from nearly 8 years earlier. At first, I did not recognize its significance. Then a memory surfaced unexpectedly. A family dinner. An argument I barely remembered. A conversation Henry seemed unusually quiet during afterward. I frowned and reread the paragraph. Henry described the evening in detail. Details I had completely forgotten. Then came a sentence that made my stomach tighten. It started that night. I simply did not understand it yet. I pushed back from the table and stared out the window. The backyard looked peaceful. The same maple tree Henry planted 20 years ago swayed gently in the breeze. Nothing about the world outside suggested that a secret had been sitting inside my attic all this time. Yet the feeling would not leave me. I looked back at the letter. Several more pages remained unread. Whatever Henry wanted me to know, he believed it was important enough to leave behind after his death. As the sunlight faded across the kitchen floor, I reached for the next page. At that moment, I still believed I was reading a letter. I had no idea I was opening the first chapter of a story my husband had been trying to tell me for years. The next page began with a date. August 14th, 8 years earlier. At first, the number meant nothing to me. Then I looked up from the letter and felt a strange sensation pass through me. The memory was there, buried somewhere beneath years of ordinary life. I closed my eyes and tried to remember. Slowly, the details returned. It had been a family barbecue at our house. David and Rachel arrived late that afternoon carrying dessert. The grandchildren played in the backyard while everyone gathered around the patio table. Nothing dramatic happened. No arguments. No raised voices. In fact, it was the kind of day I would have described as perfectly normal. Yet, according to Henry's letter, that was where everything began. I looked back at the page. Henry described conversations I barely remembered. Small comments. Casual observations. Tiny moments that seemed insignificant at the time. Reading his words felt like watching someone shine a flashlight into corners I had never bothered to examine. One paragraph immediately caught my attention. You laughed when Rachel said it. I did too. Looking back, neither of us should have. I frowned. What had Rachel said? I continued reading. According to Henry, the conversation centered around the future. Retirement. Property values. Long-term plans. At one point, Rachel joked that one day everything would belong to the next generation anyway. I vaguely remembered the comment. Everyone laughed, including me. It sounded harmless. Yet Henry saw something I missed. He wrote that Rachel kept returning to the same subject throughout the afternoon. The house, family assets, future ownership. Not once. Several times. I read the paragraph twice. Then a third time. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Rachel asking detailed questions about the property taxes. Rachel asking whether the mortgage had been paid off. Rachel asking whether we planned to stay in the house forever. At the time, I thought she was making conversation. Nothing more. Henry apparently disagreed. The next section of the letter unsettled me even further. He described changes so gradual I never noticed them happening. Family decisions that slowly shifted away from us. Information that increasingly seemed to flow through Rachel. Small moments where David stopped answering questions directly and instead looked toward his wife first. Individually, none of it sounded suspicious. Together, however, they formed a pattern. I set the letter down and stared across the kitchen. The evening sunlight had almost disappeared. Shadows stretched across the room. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn mower hummed faintly before falling silent. Everything around me felt normal. Yet my understanding of the past was beginning to change. I picked up the letter again. Henry's handwriting became slightly less neat on the next page, as though he had been writing quickly. If you are reading this, I need you to remember something. I never wanted to believe what I was seeing. That sentence stayed with me. Henry was not a cynical man. He trusted people. He always tried to see the best in others. The idea that he spent years questioning something without telling me felt deeply unsettling. The next paragraph contained another detail I had forgotten completely. A family gathering 5 years earlier. Rachel answering a question directed at me. Then another. Then another. According to Henry, nobody seemed to notice. Neither did I. Until now. Suddenly, the memory felt strangely vivid. Rachel smiling while explaining what I supposedly thought about a vacation. Rachel speaking for me before I had a chance to answer. I remembered it clearly now. At the time, it seemed harmless. Helpful even. Yet sitting alone in my kitchen years later, I found myself looking at that memory through Henry's eyes instead of my own. And for the first time, I began wondering how many other moments I had misunderstood. Then I reached the bottom of the page and found a single sentence underlined twice. There is someone you need to speak to. Someone who knows the rest of the story. For several minutes, I stared at the underlined sentence at the bottom of the page. There is someone you need to speak to. Someone who knows the rest of the story. The words felt heavier than everything else I had read so far. I turned the page expecting a name. Instead, I found another memory. Henry described a family gathering from 6 years earlier. At first, I did not understand why it mattered. Then I realized something unsettling. Every example in the letter shared the same pattern. It was never about a single event. It was about repetition. Rachel asking questions about the future. Rachel speaking on behalf of other people. Rachel somehow becoming the center of information whenever family decisions were discussed. One paragraph stopped me completely. I noticed that people stopped asking you directly. They began asking Rachel instead. I lowered the letter and looked across the room. The realization struck harder than I expected. Henry was right. Somewhere along the way, that had happened. Family members increasingly called Rachel when they needed updates. Holiday plans flowed through Rachel. Information passed through Rachel. Even when conversations involved me, I often learned about them secondhand. At the time, I thought it was simply because she was organized, helpful, efficient. Now I was not so sure. I continued reading. Henry described an incident I had forgotten entirely. During a family vacation, someone asked whether I wanted to extend the trip by 2 days. Before I could answer, Rachel politely explained that I preferred returning home. The decision was made within seconds. Nobody questioned it, including me. I remembered the moment now. What unsettled me was not Rachel's response. It was how natural it seemed. Looking back, I realized she had answered for me dozens of times over the years. Sometimes it involved small things. Sometimes it involved larger decisions. Yet the pattern remained the same. The next page contained something different. Henry stopped discussing memories and began discussing observations. The tone of the letter shifted. It became more direct, more urgent. If I am correct, then what you are seeing is not random. It did not happen overnight. It happened one conversation at a time. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. The more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. None of the examples in the letter involved dramatic betrayals. No arguments. No obvious conflicts. Just subtle shifts that slowly changed how information moved through the family. Suddenly, I understood why Henry had struggled to explain his concerns. Nothing looked suspicious by itself. Only when viewed together did the pattern emerge. I folded the page carefully and reached for the next one. A small envelope slipped free from between the sheets and landed on the table. My pulse quickened immediately. I picked it up and turned it over. On the front, written in Henry's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 words. Open this after reading. My fingers trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a business card. Richard Palmer, attorney at law. The name meant nothing to me at first. Then a distant memory surfaced. Richard attended a dinner at our house years ago. He and Henry spent most of the evening discussing estate planning and family businesses. I had not thought about him in nearly a decade. Tucked behind the business card was a short handwritten note. Richard has copies of everything. If you want answers, call him. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, darkness had settled over the neighborhood. The kitchen clock ticked steadily on the wall. I looked from the card to the letter and back again. Until that moment, I believed I was reading Henry's memories. Now I realized something else. Henry had not left me a letter. He had left me instructions. And whatever Richard Palmer knew, Henry believed it was important enough to place in the hands of a lawyer rather than his own family. I called Richard Palmer the next morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I expected a receptionist, perhaps a voicemail. Instead, a calm voice answered on the second ring. When I introduced myself, there was a brief silence. "Mrs. Brooks," he said carefully, "I have been expecting that call for a very long time." The response immediately sent a chill through me. I glanced at Henry's business card resting beside my coffee cup. "You knew I would contact you?" I asked. Another pause followed. "Your husband hoped you never would," Richard replied. But he prepared for the possibility. Less than 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him inside a quiet office on the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books. Framed certificates lined the walls. Everything about the place felt orderly and deliberate. Richard himself appeared to be in his late 60s. Gray hair, calm eyes, the kind of person who spent a lifetime listening before speaking. He placed a thin folder on the conference table between us. "Before we begin," he said, "tell me how much of the letter you have read." I explained everything. The memories, the observations, the repeated references to Rachel, the feeling that Henry had been trying to warn me about something he never fully explained. Richard listened without interruption. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "That sounds exactly like Henry." I looked down at the folder. "What did he leave with you?" Richard rested his hands on top of it. "Records." The answer felt strangely simple. Records of what? Conversations, notes, observations, correspondence. My stomach tightened. Richard opened the folder and removed several pages. The first document contained dates spanning nearly 10 years. Beside each date was a short entry written in Henry's handwriting. I immediately recognized it. One note described a holiday gathering. Another described a family discussion about finances. A third referenced a conversation involving Rachel and future property decisions. None of the entries seemed dramatic. Yet together they painted a picture I was beginning to recognize. A pattern. Richard handed me another page. This one contained a sentence underlined twice. "Information is power. Pay attention to who controls it." I stared at the words. Suddenly, memories from the previous night returned. Rachel answering questions directed at me. Rachel managing conversations. Rachel becoming the source of information inside the family. Richard watched quietly while I read. "Your husband noticed something years before he understood it," he said. "What?" I asked. Richard leaned back slightly. He noticed that family decisions increasingly flowed through a single person. The room felt unusually quiet. Outside the window, traffic moved slowly through the city streets. Inside, I found myself remembering dozens of small moments I had dismissed over the years. Moments that now seemed far more important. Richard reached into the folder again and removed a sealed envelope. Unlike the others, this one was addressed directly to him. "Henry instructed me not to open this unless you contacted me after reading the letter." My pulse quickened. "Did you open it?" Richard nodded. "Yesterday." He carefully slid the envelope across the table. "I think you should read it." My fingers felt unsteady as I unfolded the page inside. The message was brief. only a few paragraphs long. Yet one sentence immediately caught my attention. If Eleanor is sitting in your office, then she has finally started seeing what I saw. I continued reading. Then I reached a name. Not Richard's. Not Rachel's. A name I had never heard before. I read it twice to make sure I understood correctly. Then I looked up. Who is this? Richard's expression changed for the first time since I arrived. Mrs. Brooks, he said quietly. That is the question your husband spent years trying to answer. The name in the letter was Claire Dawson. I read it again, hoping something would spark a memory. Nothing did. I looked up at Richard. Who is she? He folded his hands and took a slow breath before answering. That is exactly what Henry wanted to know. The response only deepened my confusion. Richard opened another section of the folder and removed several documents held together by a paper clip. Most were copies of emails and handwritten notes. A few contained dates. Others contained names. Claire Dawson appeared repeatedly throughout the pages. Henry first noticed the name 7 years ago, Richard explained. At first, he assumed it was insignificant. I lowered my eyes to the documents. One note described a family fundraiser. Another referenced a holiday gathering. A third mentioned a community event Rachel helped organize. Claire's name appeared beside each entry. Who was she? I asked again. Richard pointed to a paragraph written by Henry. According to the notes, Claire and Rachel became close friends shortly after David and Rachel married. Nothing unusual about that. Families make friends. Communities overlap. Yet Henry continued documenting the connection year after year. The frequency of the references seemed excessive. Your husband became curious when he realized Claire appeared in situations involving family decisions more often than anyone else outside the family. I studied the pages carefully. At first, the connection seemed harmless. Then I noticed something strange. Several entries involved information that should have remained private. Discussions about property. Conversations about finances. Family disagreements. Somehow, details from inside our family were appearing in contexts where they did not belong. Richard slid another page toward me. This one contained a direct quote from Henry's. Notes. Rachel shares information before decisions are finalized. Claire always seems to know things early. I frowned. You think Rachel was talking to her? Richard shook his head slightly. Henry thought so. The question was why. The room fell silent. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected off nearby office windows. I stared at the notes and felt a growing sense of unease. Over the years, Rachel had become increasingly involved in family matters. Planning holidays, coordinating schedules, managing communication. Everyone trusted her, including me. Yet Henry had spent years tracking something he clearly found troubling. Richard opened another folder and removed several printed emails. Unlike the others, these messages did not come from family members. Claire's name appeared in the sender field. I scanned the first page, then the second. My pulse quickened. The emails contained references to conversations that had supposedly occurred inside our family. Conversations I remembered. The problem was that the details were wrong. Subtly wrong. Events had been reframed. Motivations reassigned. Small changes transformed ordinary situations into entirely different stories. This is what concerned Henry, Richard said quietly. Not the information itself. The way it was being interpreted. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. Several years earlier, a relative accused me of being upset about a family vacation. I had no idea what they were talking about. Another time, someone apologized for a disagreement I never had. At the time, I blamed miscommunication. Now I wondered if something else had been happening. The further I read, the more familiar the pattern became. Facts remained mostly intact. Meanings changed. Tiny adjustments created completely different impressions. It reminded me of looking through a window with slightly warped glass. The scene remained recognizable, but not entirely accurate. Richard leaned forward slightly. Henry eventually stopped focusing on Claire. I looked up. Why? Richard tapped the folder. Because he realized Claire was not the source. The room felt suddenly smaller. Then who was? Richard met my gaze. That is where the next file begins. He reached into his briefcase and removed a thick envelope sealed with Henry's signature across the flap. The moment I saw it, I knew whatever answers I was searching for had been waiting inside that envelope all along. Richard placed the sealed envelope on the conference table and stepped back slightly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Henry's signature stretched across the flap in dark blue ink. Even after 3 years, I recognized every curve of his handwriting instantly. Somehow, seeing it there made everything feel more real. Less like a mystery, more like a conversation delayed by time. He instructed me not to open that envelope, Richard said quietly. It was meant for you alone. My fingers hesitated above the seal. Part of me wanted answers. Another part feared what those answers might be. Henry had already revealed more in a single day than I had discovered in the previous decade. I finally opened the envelope and unfolded the documents inside. The first page was a letter. The second contained notes. The third appeared to be a timeline. I began reading. Eleanor, if you have reached this point, then Richard has already shown you enough to understand that something was wrong. What I could not understand for years was whether it happened intentionally. I paused and looked up. Richard remained silent. The next paragraph immediately drew my attention. Claire was never the problem. Claire was simply repeating information she believed was true. I continued reading. According to Henry's notes, he eventually stopped investigating Claire and began tracing where the information originated. Every path led back to the same place. Rachel, not because she was openly dishonest, not because she invented stories, because she consistently positioned herself between events and everyone else's understanding of those events. My pulse quickened. The description sounded disturbingly familiar. Henry's observations matched many of the memories I had been revisiting since finding the letter. Family disagreements that somehow changed shape. Conversations remembered differently by different people. Decisions made based on information I never provided. The timeline attached to the letter documented years of examples. One involved a holiday gathering. Another involved a vacation. A third involved a disagreement about family finances. In every case, the facts remained mostly intact. What changed was interpretation. Henry had highlighted a sentence near the middle of the page. Control the explanation, and eventually you control the memory. I read the line twice. Then a third time. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Richard finally spoke. Your husband spent years trying to determine whether he was imagining the pattern. I looked up. Was he? Richard shook his head. No, he reached into another folder and removed several pages. These documents contained side-by-side comparisons. On one side appeared actual conversations documented shortly after they happened. On the other side appeared later descriptions of those same events shared with relatives and friends. The differences were subtle, yet they changed everything. A disagreement became an overreaction. A concern became criticism. A question became a complaint. Tiny adjustments transformed ordinary events into entirely different stories. Suddenly, countless memories made sense. Moments where relatives reacted strangely. Situations where people seemed to believe things I never said. Incidents that felt confusing at the time but impossible to explain. Henry had been tracking those moments for years. The final page in the envelope contained a handwritten note. Unlike the others, this one appeared rushed. The handwriting was slightly uneven. Eleanor, if I am right, then the greatest family secret is not hidden money, property, or inheritance. It is the fact that people stopped speaking directly to one another. I felt a lump form in my throat. The sentence carried a painful truth. Over time, conversations had become filtered. Information had become mediated. Assumptions had replaced communication. Richard watched quietly while I folded the note. There is one final file, he said. My eyes lifted immediately. Final file. He nodded. The one Henry considered most important. A heavy folder appeared from the bottom of his briefcase. Unlike everything else, this folder contained recent documents. Very recent. My stomach tightened. Whatever secrets Henry discovered years ago, he apparently believed they were still affecting the family right up until the end of his life. And for the first time, I began to suspect that the truth was much closer to the present than I ever imagined. Richard opened the final folder and spread several documents across the conference table. Unlike the older records, these pages were recent. Some were only a few months old. Others had been created shortly before Henry passed away. Immediately, I noticed something different. The notes were more detailed, more urgent. Henry's handwriting appeared firmer, almost as though he understood time was running short. He spent the last year reviewing everything, Richard explained quietly. Not because he wanted conflict, because he wanted certainty. I picked up the first page and began reading. The document contained a timeline of family events stretching across the previous 18 months. Birthdays, holidays, family dinners, routine conversations. At first, Nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed Henry's notes in the margins. Information changed after passing through Rachel. David repeated concerns that originated elsewhere. Family members reacting to things Eleanor never said. My stomach tightened. The pattern had not disappeared. It had continued. One entry immediately caught my attention. During a family dinner, David expressed concern that I was becoming increasingly isolated. According to Henry's notes, the concern did not originate with David. It originated with Rachel. Another entry described a discussion about my future living arrangements. Again, Rachel appeared at the center of the conversation, not controlling it directly, guiding it, framing it, interpreting it. The distinction mattered. Richard handed me another document. This one contained copies of text messages Henry saved before his death. Several conversations involved family members discussing me. What shocked me was not what they said. It was how consistently they described the same version of me. Difficult, withdrawn, uninterested in family gatherings, resistant to help. The descriptions felt strangely familiar because they matched the narratives Henry had been documenting for years. Yet they bore little resemblance to reality. I looked up. They actually believed this. Richard nodded slowly. Most of them did. The realization hurt more than I expected. Not because anyone intended harm. Because they trusted information they believed was accurate. Over time, those assumptions became accepted truth. Henry understood that. The next document revealed something even more troubling. Several family decisions had been made based on those assumptions. Invitations adjusted. Conversations redirected. Expectations changed. Nobody excluded me intentionally. They simply responded to a version of me that never existed. Suddenly, countless experiences from the last few years made sense. The missing invitations, the strange apologies, the awkward conversations, the growing feeling that I was somehow drifting away from my own family. Richard remained silent while I continued reading. Finally, I reached the last page in the folder. Unlike the others, it contained a personal note written only weeks before Henry's passing. Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I was unable to finish what I started. Please remember something important. Secrets survive because people stop comparing what they hear with what they know. I stared at the sentence. It felt painfully true. Henry had spent years collecting observations. Yet his goal was never to expose anyone. His goal was to reconnect facts with reality, to restore direct communication, to remove the filters that had quietly inserted themselves between family members. Richard folded his hands. Your husband believed the truth would eventually reveal itself. I looked down at the documents one last time. Then another realization settled over me. David and Rachel had no idea I had seen any of this. As far as they knew, life remained exactly the same. Family dinners continued. Conversations continued. Assumptions continued. The truth remained hidden. For now, I carefully gathered the documents and placed them back inside the folder. As I stood to leave, Richard handed me one final note from Henry. Only a single sentence appeared on the page. When the time comes, do not argue. Let the truth introduce itself. I folded the note and slipped it into my purse. For the first time since finding the letter, I understood exactly what Henry wanted me to do. And more importantly, what he wanted me not to do. For the next 2 weeks, I followed Henry's instructions exactly. I did not confront David. I did not confront Rachel. I did not mention Richard Palmer or the documents sitting inside the folder on my desk. Instead, I watched. I listened. Most importantly, I paid attention. Once Henry showed me what to look for, I began noticing things everywhere. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of moments people rarely remember. Yet those moments told a story. One Sunday afternoon, David called to ask whether I planned to attend a family gathering the following weekend. Before I could answer, Rachel's voice appeared in the background. A few seconds later, David changed the subject entirely. Another evening, a cousin called to thank me for understanding why she could not attend a family event. The problem was that nobody had ever discussed the event with me. The conversation ended politely, but the pattern remained. Information was still moving through the same channels. Assumptions were still being made. The difference now was that I could see it happening. Then, 3 weeks after my meeting with Richard, an invitation arrived. David and Rachel were hosting a large family dinner. Nearly everyone would be there. Cousins, aunts, uncles, friends, the entire family. The moment I saw the invitation, I felt a strange sense of certainty. Henry had spent years collecting observations. Richard had spent years preserving them. Now, For the first time, I understood why. The dinner was scheduled for Saturday evening. I arrived shortly before 6 o'clock carrying a pie and a folder. The pie was for dessert. The folder remained hidden inside my bag. The house buzzed with conversation. Children moved through the hallway laughing. Music drifted from a speaker in the living room. On the surface, everything appeared perfectly normal. Rachel greeted me warmly at the door. David hugged me. Relatives smiled and asked how I had been. Looking around the room, I realized something surprising. Nobody here considered themselves part of a secret. Nobody believed they were participating in a deception. They were simply responding to information they trusted. That distinction mattered. Dinner began shortly afterward. Conversations flowed easily. Family stories filled the room. Plans for future holidays were discussed. Vacation ideas were shared. Throughout it all, I noticed the same pattern Henry described years earlier. Questions directed toward one person often received answers from another. Clarifications arrived before anyone requested them. Interpretations appeared alongside facts. Once you recognize something, it becomes impossible to stop seeing it. After dessert, everyone moved into the living room. Coffee cups appeared. Conversations separated into smaller groups. The atmosphere felt comfortable, familiar. Rachel seemed completely relaxed, confident. She laughed easily and moved from conversation to conversation exactly as she always had. She had no reason to suspect anything was different. Nobody did. Then David stood and tapped his glass lightly. The room gradually quieted. "Before everyone leaves," he said, smiling, "I just want to thank all of you for staying connected as a family." People nodded. Several relatives raised their cups. It was a simple moment, an ordinary moment. Yet listening to him speak, I found myself thinking about Henry's final note. Do not argue. Let the truth introduce itself. My fingers brushed against the folder resting inside my bag. Years of observations. Notes. Correspondence. Timelines. Not accusations. Facts. Quiet facts waiting patiently for their turn. As the room settled into silence again, I realized the moment Henry spent years preparing for had finally arrived. And for the first time since opening that letter in my kitchen, I understood exactly why he never wanted me to fight the story. Because stories can always be challenged. The truth cannot. The room remained quiet after David finished speaking. Family members smiled and raised their coffee cups. The atmosphere felt warm, comfortable, familiar. Yet, sitting there with Henry's folder resting inside my bag, I understood something nobody else in that room knew. The family secret Henry spent years trying to understand was never about money. It was never about inheritance. It was never about hidden accounts or missing documents. It was about something far more powerful. The way information shaped relationships. I stood slowly and waited until a few conversations settled. "There is something I would like to share," I said. My voice remained calm. No anger. No accusation. Just a simple request. Everyone turned toward me. Rachel smiled politely. David looked curious. I reached into my bag and removed the folder. A few months before he passed away, Henry left something for me. The room grew noticeably quieter. Several relatives immediately recognized his name. I opened the folder and carefully removed the first page. "He spent years documenting family memories," I explained. At first, I thought these were simply personal notes. Rachel's expression remained relaxed. Then I discovered they were actually observations. I began reading several short passages. Nothing dramatic. A conversation remembered differently by different people. A decision explained one way to one family member and another way to someone else. An invitation declined on behalf of someone who was never asked. Small moments. Ordinary moments. Yet as I continued reading, people slowly began recognizing them. Several relatives exchanged glances. Others frowned thoughtfully. David leaned forward in his chair. Then I shared one of Henry's notes describing how family information increasingly passed through a single source before reaching everyone else. Again, no accusations, just observations. I handed copies of several pages to family members sitting nearby. The room remained silent as they read. Rachel's smile finally began to fade. "I do not understand," she said carefully. "What exactly are you trying to say?" I looked toward her. "Nothing." The answer surprised her. "I am not trying to say anything. Henry already did." Then I read one final passage. "Control the explanation, and eventually you control the memory." The words settled over the room. Nobody spoke immediately. They did not need to. The documents were doing exactly what Henry intended. They were reconnecting facts with memories. One relative quietly mentioned a misunderstanding from years earlier. Another remembered an invitation that never reached its intended person. A third recalled being told something that later turned out not to be entirely accurate. None of the stories sounded malicious. That was the point. The secret was never hidden inside one dramatic event. It lived inside hundreds of small assumptions. David eventually lowered the pages and looked across the room. His expression carried something I had not seen in years. Clarity. "Mom," he said softly, "I think Dad was trying to tell us that we stopped talking directly to each other." I smiled. "I think so too." Rachel looked down at the documents resting in her hands. For the first time all evening, she seemed uncertain. Not defeated, not humiliated, simply confronted by a reality she had never fully examined. The conversation that followed remained calm. No arguments, no shouting, just people comparing memories and realizing how easily misunderstandings can grow when information passes through too many filters. As the evening came to an end, family members hugged one another and slowly gathered their belongings. Several relatives thanked me for sharing Henry's notes. Others admitted they wished they had asked more questions over the years. Later that night, I returned home and sat alone at the kitchen table where this journey began. Henry's final letter rested beside me. I unfolded the first page one last time and reread the opening sentence. "If you are reading this, it means I ran out of time." I smiled softly. The truth was, Henry had not run out of time at all. He simply found another way to tell the story. And as I looked around the quiet house we built together, I finally understood what his final letter had revealed. The greatest family secret was never hidden in the past. It was hidden in the stories people accepted without ever asking whether they were true.